YouTube thing trying to get the live stream up and fired. It was trying to do like screen recordings and not do like the video or something. I don't know what it was trying to do, but anyhow, we got the live stream up and running now. So thank you for joining in. When you do join into the live stream, please go hit that like button. By hitting the like button or the thumbs up, you will get the algorithm to pick up the video and spread it around for more people to join in. And it's always more fun to have people joining in when we're doing the live stream because the comment section is so much more fun. But today we're going to be talking about some of the mainstream media articles that are out right now. There's a couple that I left down in the description, and they keep enhancing the inflationary scenario that everybody is feeling. They know the pain from it. They are experiencing it. And no matter what, when you bring up like the ideas that inflation is coming down or that there might be a relief to the inflationary pressures that we're experiencing, everybody loses their mind and they just talk about how much everything costs. And then they give examples of how everything is so much more expensive. Now, I'm not trying to deny the idea that there's inflation happening out there. But what I'm trying to really get out, especially with a lot of the videos that I've been doing lately, is that the inflationary scenario that we are experiencing helped the Federal Reserve. It actually saved the Federal Reserve from failure. And this is something that I find very interesting as far as the theory behind it, because most people who are screaming inflation and how inflation is painful and how it's destroying their lives are usually have of the mindset that they are against the Federal Reserve. Like they're trying to fight the Fed, they're upset with the Fed. The Fed is the reason why we're having all this inflation. And by even carrying that narrative, that idea, it actually benefits the Fed. And that's what's funny about it is like they want to fight the Fed, they want to argue and get the Fed out, but yet the exact thing that they are believing and their expectations coming into the future is what's giving the Federal Reserve the ammunition that they need in order to conduct themselves going into the future. Like literally saves them to have an inflationary expectation that is elevated. And that is so strange to think, but yet that is the truth of the matter right now. So every time I see articles or I hear people talking about how inflation is going to run rampant, it's going to kill you, it's going to destroy, they're going to keep interest rates elevated going into the future, and all this stuff that keeps getting pushed out there, again, all that does is benefit the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. Now, this is really difficult for a lot of people to understand, and I get why. Like most of the time when you think about the Federal Reserve in the classical form, is that when they raise interest rates, that puts a burden on the consumer. When they lower interest rates, that enhances the consumer. So they lower interest rates, people go out, they borrow money to buy houses and cars and go on vacation. And then it's really obvious when you look out there and you see all the people who have borrowed all this money to have this fancy life. And then they wonder what it is that they need to do in order to maintain that when everything churns, right? So the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to try and put a burden on the consumer, and all of a sudden businesses start slowing down. Money isn't easy free flowing like it once was, and making those debt payments becomes very burdensome, and now the consumer is not participating within the economy. And now again, this is a very classical form of understanding the Federal Reserve, and it's not too far off from reality. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And oh, sorry guys, the dice. All right, let me get you the dice. Can't do this without the dice, right? But and it's not too far off from the reality of the situation. I mean, there's a lot of truth in that understanding and that belief, but it's not necessarily the way the Federal Reserve is looking how to make inflation or how to create an inflationary scenario, or how to create a deflationary scenario or a disinflationary scenario. It doesn't come from those interest rate adjustments like everybody seems to believe, right? And it's hard and it's really difficult to try and wrap your head around an idea that doesn't necessarily involve them interest rates, because that's the only thing that everybody ever looks at. It says, okay, the Federal Reserve has one of two tools, interest rate adjustments and balance sheet adjustments. That's it. That's the only thing that they can really do is one of those two things, right? Either increase and decrease the balance sheet or increase and decrease interest rates. After that, they're done. There's no more ammunition, or there's no more tools. But that is not correct. That is not correct at all, right? It's correct in the classical form of believing the Federal Reserve and their understanding of their monetary policy, but it's not correct in the reality of the situation in which that they use their words right? Their words are more important than their actions when it comes to the monetary policy. And this is very important to understand because it's not me who's making this up. Or, I mean, this is from the Federal Reserve. This is through their own statements about their communication styles on how it is that they conduct themselves in order to achieve the goals that they are looking for. And a lot of it has to do with propaganda within the mainstream media. So again, when I read these articles, when I see these people coming out there and talking about it, again, what kind of feelings or beliefs does that put out there into the markets, into the economy? It has people very leery. It says, okay, yeah, I feel the inflationary pressures. I know that there's inflation coming. I see how the Federal Reserve is responding to it. They're going to keep interest rates elevated, and this is going to be the painful experience that we are going to get from it. I mean, I see it every day. I work retail. People ask me all the time, what are lumber prices doing? I said, man, lumber prices are cheap. You should get it while you can. They go, really? And I'm like, yeah, they've been down for a while. I mean, if you need lumber, you should get it while you can. And they're like, well, really? I didn't know lumber was down. It's like nobody talks about it. Now you're starting to see some of the articles coming out, but for months now, nobody's knowing about it. Nobody talks about it except for a handful of people here on, here on my channel. But we think about it, like, what is it that's really taking place here, right? Like, why in the world would the Federal Reserve want this higher inflation and the higher inflation expectation? I mean, all these people have to experience this pain. Is this really necessary? And now I understand that a lot of people will look at it and say, oh yeah, they're doing this on purpose to destroy the middle class because they want all the wealth for themselves. Yeah, I mean, I could see that taking place. So that, I mean, I don't necessarily believe that was the exact reasoning behind it. But, I see where the guy, like how people in the know and the people within power could certainly take advantage of the situation that is happening there. So if one wants to believe they're doing it on purpose, then, I mean, I guess that's the case. But I don't really necessarily see it as being done on purpose as much as they're taking advantage of the situation that they have at hand. Now, really, what is it that the Federal Reserve is looking for by keeping this inflation expectation elevated? Is that they're hoping that the neutral interest rate will rise. And now this is probably the most important part to understand, is that everybody who is looking at the inflationary scenario thinking that, okay, once inflation comes down to the 2%, we'll have the Federal Reserve adjusting their monetary policy to try and maintain this 2% target over time. That is not correct, right? They're going for a 2% target over time, not for a 2% target in the current fashion. So what they are looking for is average inflation, which means that they could be running at 1% inflation or 3% inflation from now on and still be achieving their goals of 2% over time. That's important to understand, right? Because most people think that they're going for a 2% target and that once they achieve this target, they're going to try and maintain that target. That is not the case. Right now, appropriate monetary policy is to have inflation moderately above 2% for some time. Now, this is not my statement. This is the statement coming from the Federal Reserve, talking about their appropriate monetary policy for current conditions. Now, this monetary policy that they are doing right now will be reviewed at the end of the year. But until then, they are seeking inflation that is moderately above 2%. I believe that they are achieving that. Now, they don't define what moderately above 2% really means. I mean, is that 2.3? Is it 2.8? Is it 3.1? Maybe it's 5. Who knows? Moderately above 2%. That's like, what does that mean? Okay. And then for some time, that doesn't make any sense either, right? You're going to have moderately above 2% for some time with no clear definition of what either one of those things are. That doesn't make any sense, right? Now, why in the world would the Federal Reserve have an appropriate monetary policy in this sort of position? Like, nobody knows this, by the way. I don't care how many mainstream media articles you go and read, there ain't not a single one of them talking about appropriate monetary policy seeking to achieve inflation moderately above 2%. There's no article out there. In fact, you will find articles that talk exactly opposite of that and talk about how the Federal Reserve is going for a 2% target and that they don't see anything other than a 2% target. It is so wrong. Time Magazine, USA Today, I've pinpointed and pulled them out and talked about them several times that these articles are spreading misinformation about the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. It is accurate to the classical form, right? But they changed. The Federal Reserve has completely changed the way that they are doing things, and nobody knows it. Like Jerome Powell stated it way back in August 27th of 2020, right? Go and look at the speech, right? He said it right in there that they have changed the way that they are viewing inflation. And now the whole point of this, again, if you have this elevated inflation expectation where you have moderately above 2% for some time, if you are conducting yourself in this fashion, then what's going to happen to the neutral interest rate? It will begin to rise. And this is truly what the Federal Reserve is looking for. Out of all the stuff, all the pain, all the things, all the concentration of wealth and destroying of the middle class and all that other stuff, yeah, that is super accurate. And there is no reason to think that that has not taken place. However, the achievement of a rising neutral interest rate is the outcome that the Federal Reserve is looking for. All the rest of the stuff is a bonus. I don't know how else you want to look at it. Like that all is, is all second to what the Federal Reserve is doing as far as raising the neutral interest rate. Like everything else is secondary to that. And once you kind of wrap your head around that idea, then it begins to start making a hell of a lot more sense when you're out there watching what it is that the Federal Reserve is communicating to the public, to the markets, how it is that people are misinterpreting it so bad, saying, oh, there's going to be 7 interest rate cuts this year and all this other stuff, because they're so stuck on this past understanding of how the Federal Reserve conducted themselves from this classical form, right? But because they have changed the way that they have done things and nobody realizes it, they are very confused. And the uncertainty that is now ripping through the economy about how the Federal Reserve is going to be adjusting their interest rates is so prevalent. That is the monetary policy. That confusion that they have now within the markets, just go and look at all the mainstream media articles. There ain't not a single one who understands exactly what's happening there. Not a single one talks about the neutral interest rate. I mean, occasionally I'll find one and I'll share it with you guys. But for the most part, every single economist that you are listening to has got all these reasonings about how the Federal Reserve is going to be dealing with the future and the inflation, but not a single one of them ever brings up the fact that the neutral interest rate was close to the lower bound of zero and that they had run out of monetary policy when the Fed funds rate had hit zero as well. That they were done, they were cooked. How many economists out there are saying, okay, they needed to change the way that they have done things in order to be able to stimulate the economy, and it came through their speech, through their words, to the mainstream media, to propaganda outlets, right? I mean, that's the only way that they could actually conduct themselves in a way that would then seek the ability to support the households and businesses, however they described it, right? And that by lowering the interest rates to zero, by going into the quantitative easing, by the government doing the massive stimulus programs, all this stuff put into, and not to mention the severing of the supply chain, right? Because that was the most important part. That once all this took place and the inflationary scenario started to take off, that was all that they needed to do, was continue to maintain that. If they could keep that inflation expectation elevated going into the future and keep it significantly elevated, they would be able to continue to push that neutral interest rate higher. And by pushing that neutral interest rate higher, what they will do is then get the room in order to stimulate the economy during the next downturn. So ultimately, the neutral interest rate is the rate that's neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. But if it's close to zero, dropping the Fed funds rate far enough below neutral to stimulate the economy was no longer working. But over time, if people continue to feel the pain, if people continue to get laid off, if people continue to tighten up on their savings, if people or on their spending and go deeper into savings, what that will do is start to raise the neutral interest rate, which we are experiencing. And now, what's interesting about this theory, right, is that if you take into consideration that the Federal Reserve is sitting still, if they can get if the markets, if the economy starts to have a rising neutral interest rate, what that will do is get ever closer to the Fed funds rate, making the economy less restricted. Ultimately, if they can create an inflationary scenario that is running rampant into the future that pushes the neutral interest rate higher, then that will actually cause a situation that is less restrictive in the economy. So backwards from what everybody else is thinking out there. So if the Federal Reserve wants to do a stimulation to the economy, they will keep pushing the inflationary scenario. And if they keep pushing that inflationary scenario, then the neutral interest rate will continue to rise, making it less restrictive on the economy, doing exactly the opposite of what everybody would anticipate. Like, nobody understands that neutral rate. Nobody understands that in relation to the monetary policy. Very few people take it into consideration. And now if you go and you think about it for just a minute, what has happened here over the last 6 months, it begins to start making a lot of sense. The resilient economy. I know there's a lot of people who are talking about job slowdown and everything slowing down, and that's true, it is. I mean, but is it to the point yet that the Fed has to stimulate? No. And in fact, if we get more of that inflationary pressure, it'll raise the neutral interest rate. It might make even more of a case for the Federal Reserve to not have to cut because of that shrinking, spread between the neutral interest rate and the standing still of the Fed funds rate. This is hard to wrap your head around, guys. I know this is difficult. For a lot of people who this might be new information for, it might just be totally just blowing their mind out. But this is how it's going down. And every time I see these inflationary pressure going to run rampant, there's no slowing down, it's going to kill you and destroy, and all the pain that everybody's experienced, which is true. But that belief and that push into the economy, that push to try and get the powers that be to do something about it, again, raises that neutral interest rate. And it's working. Like, this plan is working for them. Nobody sees it, nobody knows it, and nobody understands the plan. That's why it doesn't make sense to them. But once you understand what it is that they're trying to do, it's just like, oh man, that is so clear. That makes so much more sense now. Because everybody was convinced, man, they're going to have to cut rates. They have no other choice. They have to. Nobody can do it. All this stuff. They have to. They don't have any other choice. I was one of the few people who are going, nah, you're going to see interest rates stay elevated for an extra long time, much longer than anybody would have ever anticipated. And in fact, that's exactly what would happen. I mean, they could go back and look at some of my videos, and this is what I had, predicted. And there's very little doubt in my mind that we will see very few cuts going into the future, so long as you have an inflation expectation that remains elevated, right? It'll relieve itself over time if the neutral interest rate can rise. It's scary. It's crazy to think about, but it's because there's so many working parts and pieces to it, and it's because you also have to disconnect from your previous belief of what it was that the Federal Reserve was doing. Like, you have to look at the Federal Reserve and say, okay, this is how they used to be, and this is how they are. And because this is how they used to be and everybody understands that, the communication about it is the new them, right? That's what's nuts about it. This is the classical, and the Federal Reserve communicating about that is the new policy, right? It's not the movement of the Fed funds rate or anything else. It's the communications about it. And and I don't know how else to explain it, but that's what I've been trying to explain for like 6 months now, or more. All right, let's check out some of these comments. All right, 267 people watching with 67 likes. Go hit that like button. I'm on my lunch, so we're only going to have maybe about another 10 or 15 minutes left, and then I'll have to cut the stream again. Fractional reserve requirements is 0. Well, I think it's the reserve requirements from the banks that you're talking about, but that's different. That's because we went to an abundant reserve system. Or, what else? I think that's what they refer to. Isn't it an abundant reserve system? Or anyway, the way that the Fed used to conduct themselves for interest rate adjustments is that they worked on what they referred to as a limited reserve system. In that these banks had a certain reserve requirement that they had to have at the end of each day. And at the end of the day, some of the big banks would have excess reserves and some of them would be in need of reserves. The ones who had excess reserves would lend them to the ones who were in need of reserves. And that overnight lending rate was the effective fund rate. Right? So this is when the Federal Reserve wanted to adjust interest rates, they would buy and sell treasuries off these big banks, adjusting the reserve levels, right? And because it was a limited reserve system, some of the big banks who had the reserves at the end of the day would have to lend them to the ones who were in need. And now, if they had a certain level in there that was an abundant one, then you would see interest rates fall. But if there was a limited amount of reserves in the system, then you would see the interest rates rise. And so by the Federal Reserve conducting themselves in this manner, by buying and selling these reserves or these treasuries off these big banks, they were able to adjust the effective fund rate from that overnight lending that was happening within the big banks. Well, something very interesting happened in September of 2019, and that is there was this huge corporate tax payment that had been made, right? So all of a sudden, a bunch of cash left the big banks and went over to the Federal Reserve to an account called the Treasury General Account. So when these taxes get paid, they leave the big banks and then move over to the Federal Reserve, to the account for the Treasury General Account, leaving these big banks without a whole lot of cash, right? Now, this limited amount of reserves for the overnight lending rate shot up to about 10%, right? Because there was all of a sudden, there was like all these reserves, all this cash had left the banks, and there wasn't enough cash in the system in order for all these banks to have the reserve requirements that they needed to operate the next day. So interest rates shot up to like 10% because these banks were looking for funds anywhere they could get it. The Federal Reserve stepped up and says, no, that's okay. We got a facility here. It's called the repo facility. Because the government was doing all this spending and they had you guys, primary dealers, these big banks were loaded up on treasuries, what the Federal Reserve said, here, give us the treasuries. We'll give you cash. You'll have enough cash to operate the next day, and we'll just keep doing this every single day, right? And this was the non-QE QE that caused the repo facility to basically fire up back in September of 2019 and then eventually become a standing repo facility within the banking systems. But once they had this repo facility up and fired up, and they fired up the quantitative easing, they basically told these big banks that you don't have a reserve requirement anymore because it's not this limited reserve system that they are trying to establish the effective fund rate at. So like these big banks at the end of the day, when they would lend those funds over to the ones who were in need of the reserves, that overnight lending rate that would establish the effective fund rate, that had essentially been removed. Since all these banks are now loaded up on cash, the cash deposit moving over to the repo facility now has the interest rate adjustments being made, right? This is where the effective fund rate is now established, is at the repo facility. But because they needed to actually channel this and be able to say, okay, we can maintain it in between these two levels, they have another spot that a bank can go and deposit money with the Federal Reserve besides the repo facility, and that is the account on excess reserves. So it is like the cheapest, lowest place that a bank would want to put money, because that's the lowest interest rate that they could possibly get. They're going to get a little bit better one at the repo facility. Between these two accounts, the repo facility and the interest on excess reserves, the account on excess reserves, between these two, they were able to channel the effective funds rate. So this is how they are able to establish what interest rates in the banking system that we experience today is through this mechanism. So a zero reserve requirement is essentially needed in an abundant reserve system if they're going to be moving those reserves over to the repo facility and interest on excess reserves. Now, if the repo facility and the limited amount of cash in the system was to deplete, if the quantitative tightening pulls enough liquidity out of the system, then what will eventually happen is that the repo facility and the interest on excess reserves would no longer establish the effective fund rate. It would move back over to the big banks in the overnight lending rate because of the limited amount of reserves that are out there in the system due to that quantitative tightening. So I hope that wasn't too confusing for everybody, but to me that makes a lot of sense why there's zero reserve requirements in the banking system right now. It's because they just don't need them to be there. Let's cruise down here to the bottom. Let's see. Man, look at all these comments. You guys are just commenting away here. I love it. Okay. Benny, alignment is key. I don't think they are aligned quite yet. When they are all in lockstep, that is when you should worry about it. All right. What were the key books that you read to help you learn economics? Sean, that's a really good question, but to be honest with you, man, I haven't really read a whole lot of books. I read The Creature from Jekyll Island. That really opened my mind about the Federal Reserve. And then I read Cantillon's essay on economic theory. Where is that book? I just had it back here just a minute. Did I take it in the house? I might have taken it in the house. Hold on one second here. Yeah, I must have taken it back into the house. It's not another computer. Nope, it's not another computer. So anyway, Cantillon's essay on economic theory is probably one of the best books. It's probably one of the best books that you could read. Is it behind the seat? It's not. As far as getting started, because Cantillon's essay on economic theory, I mean, it goes way back to like the 1700s. It's hundreds of years old, but he talks about the underlying economic forces that we are experiencing today. Now, of course, he's talking about horses and wagons, and it's really out of date, and villages, and just like all kinds of like really, kind of old stuff, right? I mean, and again, it's hundreds of years old. But the 3 chapters on the increase and decrease of money to the state, right? Chapters 6, 7, and 8 of part 2 of that essay are absolutely just mind-blowing on how like accurate he really describes what happens when new money starts to pour into the system and how the people react and behave to that. What happens to domestic manufacturing, what happens to foreign production, what happens when this new money turns off. It is so good. Like, those 3 chapters are incredibly important to read. And you don't have to buy the essay. You can go get the essay for free at the Mises Institute. So just type in Cantillon's essay on economic theory and you should be able to find it right away. However, if you do want to buy the essay, I left a link down in the description to an Amazon affiliate link. So if you go and buy the essay off of Amazon, I will get a little bit of commission for your purchasing of that essay. But even if you don't buy the essay, just by clicking on that link and then going and putting whatever you want into the shopping cart, I will also get a commission on all those items that you put into the shopping cart for the next 24 hours. So you don't have to buy the essay, just go buy whatever you want. But before you go and make that purchase, click on the affiliate link down in the description and then go buy whatever you want. So again, anything that you put in that cart for the next 24 hours, I will get a commission on as well, as long as you make that purchase within the next 30 days. So you can support the Uneducated Economist just by simply buying whatever you want off of Amazon and just following that affiliate link. Benny, get Simon his commission so he and I can hit the road for a nice tour. Yeah, right, Benny? See, this is the thing. I need to come up with that thing that I can really sell, like my own book, my own course. Once we got that, we're going to be hitting the road. Once we get that up and moving, Lee, it's pretty beginner friendly. Yeah, the essay is really good. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's easy to read. I mean, I got through pretty much the whole thing, and I don't know, it took me like a month or something like that because I'm a really, really slow reader. But yeah, reading through those chapters, those 3 chapters of the increase and decrease of money to the state, just it will really open your mind to a lot of the issues that we are experiencing. Just don't do what Graham Stevens does by selling a bad product. Does he sell a bad product? Like, I mean, I watched Graham stuff. I mean, I used to watch it a lot more a few years ago. I watched him and I watched Meet Kevin quite a bit because I really liked the way that they were building their YouTube channels up. I mean, they were growing very fast and, they had quite an audience and engagement with their audience. But I think I kind of just do things a little differently than most YouTubers. For one, I don't do any edits, right? I'm really pretty genuine with everything that I have to say and, everything that I'm doing. Like, I don't try to fake it. I don't try to impress you with anything. I don't have anything to impress you with anyway, so I couldn't impress you with anything I have anyhow, so it was like, again, nothing there. But I really do think that I could have a product that I think would be very useful to a lot of people. I mean, just the ideas and some of the theories that I have come up with and how I've explained them to a lot of people. I cannot believe how many individuals have come to me and say, man, I wasn't even caring about economics, but I was in the lumber, like I was in construction, your videos popped up, and now I feel like I am really involved with the ideas of what's going on with the macroeconomics. I understand things on a so much better level than I ever thought I ever would. And that was just simply just hanging out, trying to figure out what was going on with the lumber industry. They were able to just pick up all this residual, information and theories and ideas. I mean, I've had people come to me and say, man, I really thank you for talking about the 4 economic theories, Gresham's law, Triffin's dilemma, the bullwhip effect, and then Cantillon's effect, right? And those 4 economic theories, once you have internalized them, I mean, this is serious too. Once you have internalized those 4 economic theories and you can explain them, like somebody says, hey, what's Gresham's law? And you can just, just state it like what it is and how it works and gives examples of it. You can do that with all 4 of those economic theories. I assure you, you'll be reading news articles and you'll be like, man, this is a combination of Triffin's dilemma and the bullwhip effect. This is a combination of this. This is like, all these things. This is like Cantillon's effect with the new money coming in and what causes the domestic manufacturers to leave. This is like, you'll start to recognize and understand the economic forces in a whole new way. Like most people, because they don't understand it, they just want to blame the leadership. Right? Because like, hey, I don't get it. I voted you to be the leader. You need to explain this stuff to me because it doesn't seem right. And then not understanding they're not in control of the economic forces. They can only interact with them. And then once you recognize these economic forces, you see how they interact with them. And sometimes it's major interaction, war, lockdowns, all kinds of stuff. Like it can seem like they're the ones who are in charge of it, but they are not, I assure you. It's the industriousness of the people themselves. We are the economy. It's our decision on what it is that we do that then gives what it is that we have out there, right? I mean, it's fun. I know it's hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around that, but it's not. They are reacting to the economy. We are the economy individually, every decision that we make. Right? And you have to think about it. The position that you're in is not the same as that I'm in or that your neighbor is in. Every one of us is in a different position. So there's no way that they could generally speak about the economy that then is going to be helpful or going to be the best position for each and every single one of us, because every single one of us is different. We have to figure out what it is that we need to do, considering our position and the current economy that is out there. We have to deal with that ourselves in our own personal form. Right? It's like being out there on that river, right? In fact, what time is it? All right, I gotta go. But it's like being out there on the river. Here, let me give you a little river view here. Oops. There's a, right? So it's like being out there on that river. Now, if you are operating one of them big freighters or if you're operating that little sailboat, you're not doing the same thing, right? I mean, the guy who's operating that big old freighter over there, he's not thinking, he's not doing, he's not even paying attention to anything like the guy who's in that little sailboat down there, right? Them 2 guys are doing things completely differently from each other, but yet they are still in the same environment, dealing with the exact same conditions, doing everything which would appear all the same for all of us. Them 2 people are not performing the same thing, right? They're both in a boat, they're both going down, heading upriver. But I guarantee you, their thoughts, their energies, their expectations, everything that they have going on right now is completely different from each other. And this is exactly how the economy is too. All right. Thank you guys for being here. I kind of really rambled it off today. Didn't get through a whole lot of comments, but I got to go back to work. So we'll give Benny a question. We'll give Benny's question in here. Okay, Simon. Question for you. We always hear about how a lot of construction indicates a strong economy. Yep. Do you think it does indicate a strong economy or a lot of debt being actively used in the economy? Very interesting. That's kind of interesting to think about, because is debt issuance a burden on the economy? It is, in the sense that you have to repay that debt, right? So beers and saws. Remember, like, what is it that debt is moving towards? So in my opinion, when you are going towards construction, you are building something and you have a product at the end of it, that's a good, strong economy being built from the debt itself, right? But if you're using that debt to go party, now we have a problem with it, because you're going to have to pay that debt back and you don't have anything to show from the production of that debt that you have taken out. So let's take it back to the beers and saws analogy real quick, because I think this is important to understand, is that if you borrowed a bunch of money and you bought beer, right? Well, there's a lot of agricultural, a lot of distribution, a lot of manufacturing, there's a lot of entertainment, advertisement, there's a lot of stuff that goes into this beer. in the production of beer and the distribution of beer and the consumption of beer. So if you borrow a bunch of money and you start into consuming beer, well, you're going to stimulate the economy. There's no doubt about it, through all the different things, agriculture, manufacturing, distribution, entertainment, all the stuff, right? It'll definitely stimulate the economy. Now, you could go and buy saws, like for cutting wood, saws. Now, if you go and buy saws, something different is going to take place, because you're going to take those saws and you're going to have to do work with them saws. So you're going to cut a bunch of wood up, fasten it together, and sell a product. Now, as you do this, time will have to go by of doing this production and saving, essentially, to pay for the saw. Once you have paid for the saw, now you can cut up as much lumber, fasten that together, sell it off, and buy as much beer as you want. Right? So if you have a beer and saws analogy and you borrow a bunch of money and you go into saws, well, you're going to create a manufacturing base that's going to be an investment that starts to pay you over time as those saws continue to work and produce. Now, if you go and dump your money into beer, you're going to stimulate the economy again. However, once the beer has been all consumed, now you have to pay back that beer that you have borrowed to consume, and you're going to have to do it with a hangover. So not only do you have to cut back on your current consumption, you have to work extra hard without consuming to pay back the past consumption that you've done. All right? And this is where the problem that we are now facing is that the United States is dumping into beer when they should be going into saws. However, they can't compete when they go into saws. Right? You go into saws and you won't be able to compete against the other people who have also moved into saws and are making products the same as you. This is what the United States is facing. So they could go to saws, but it won't work. So they go to beer, and then we have to work twice as hard with the hangover to pay back for that consumption. And this is really what we're experiencing. We should be building those houses, right? You build houses, and that's going to have a return. That's going to be a product that is here that doesn't go anywhere. It stays in America. It's American made, American produced, American labor, American profit, and it stays here. The product doesn't go anywhere. All right. So to me, like, building homes is probably the number one manufacturing product here in the United States. And I don't see it happening. Like, I don't see it happening on a grand scale. Not one that could actually stimulate the economy in a way that is like, wow, look how profound this is. Only thing I see is house prices going up and people getting pissed about it because of the ever-increasing amounts of separation between the rich and the poor, and that is going to continue. There is no doubt in my mind. Unless we have a total collapse of the system, you're going to have ever-increasing amounts of separation between the rich and the poor. And Cantillon's essay describes it. So, all right. Loved it today, guys. Really rambled on, but it was a nice live stream that we had. 238 people watching with 120 likes. Please go hit that like button before you leave the live stream. The YouTube algorithm will pick it up and spread it around for more people to join in and, continue on with the conversation. Thank you very much for being here. Links are down in the description. Uneducated Economist, you let me know.